Good evening. I'm Sue Dodds. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at UTas, and on behalf of the University of Tasmania, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Muwinina people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's public lecture, which recognises today International Women's Day, which has now been celebrated around the globe for over a century. Excuse me. Tonight's International Women's Day address will be delivered by the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Senator Bob Carr, who will be reflecting on progress made in the effort to address the Millennium Development Goal 3 of promoting gender equality and empowering women. I'd like to recognise that tonight's International Women's Day address is supported by a partnership involving the United Nations Association of Australia, and to note Mr. Pat McConville, who's here to represent the United Nations Association of Australia Tasmanian Division, and Senator Lisa Singh, Labor Senator for Tasmania, as a return to UTas, and Lisa will now introduce Senator Carr and tonight's address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. And as an alumni, it's lovely to always be back here, what I call the Stanley Burbury Theatre, but of course it's now known as the University Centre. Well, today, as many of you would be aware, is International Women's Day, but it's also the 103rd year of International Women's Day, a day now recognised, of course, by the United Nations, and of course a day to reflect on the progress and the ongoing future direction needed to be taken, but also the progress made by women and for women's rights. It's also time to look forward to, as I said, that future direction and the progress still to be made. But it's also good to reflect that today is actually a holiday in many parts of the globe. I think in Nepal, in Vietnam, Burkina Faso, an official holiday is celebrated, something perhaps that could one day be a possibility here in Australia, Minister. International Women's Day, of course, many of you would know, is celebrated by three colours: green, white and purple. White representing purity, purple representing dignity and self-respect, and green standing for hope and new life. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is "A promise is a promise, time for action to end violence against women." Violence against women, of course, is still, unfortunately, a huge problem across the globe. 1 in 3 women, which is a total of 1 billion people worldwide, will be subject to violence in their lifetime. And across the world, that gender gap in life expectancy, educational opportunities and economic achievement is still quite stark. So, international aid that supports women and girls is important. Millennium Development Goal 3, gender equality, is important. And that's why Australia's aid program strongly supports gender equality through programs that lift women out of poverty. But I think we all have a responsibility as members of a community to share amongst women and men to speak out for what is right and what is wrong. We must ensure that our daughters of our community grow up with the same opportunities as our sons and work to bring that opportunity to the entire human family across the world. So just as we might be advocates for our community, Australia must be an advocate amongst the international community. And we must not only speak, but act for women. And that is why Australia's aid program and foreign policy is such an important tool for gender equality, and why tonight we are incredibly privileged to have an advocate for peace and security and human rights in Minister Bob Carr here on International Women's Day in Tasmania to speak about what Australia is doing. Many of you would be aware of the career of Bob Carr. In March 1995, he was elected as Premier of New South Wales and was re-elected 2 times after that, retiring from that position in 2005 and becoming the longest continuing serving Premier in New South Wales' history. His achievements in that time were many, but perhaps one of the most important examples of public diplomacy is Australia's history. Minister Carr was Premier as Sydney hosted the world's best ever Olympics in 2000. As Premier, he introduced the world's first carbon trading scheme and curbed clearing of native vegetation as anti-greenhouse measures. He was a member of the International Task Force on Climate Change, convened by Tony Blair, and was made life member of the Wilderness Society in 2003. In March 2012, almost a year ago now, he was designated Minister for Foreign Affairs by Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And since his swearing in the Senate and Cabinet on March the 13th, 2012, I've been privileged to call him my colleague as a senator and a member of the Gillard Labor government. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Minister Bob Carr. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lisa Singh. Sue Dodds, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts here, this beautiful university. Ladies and gentlemen, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I note that all that International Women's Day represents, and it's a great honour to be here with my parliamentary colleague, Lisa Singh, who organised a terrific program today. At Ogilvie High School, for example, I was honoured to address an audience that comprised girls from 5 girls' schools. Was 5? 5. And I told them this story. I told them about me being in Cambodia and being at an eye hospital in Siem Reap. The Fred Hollows Foundation has been instrumental in setting this up. And poor peasants arrive there. They haven't been able to see for years or decades, or to see properly. They're groping around. They've got to be helped by family members. And within the space of a few hours, they have their sight restored. Surgeons and nurses who Australia has trained, remove the degeneration of their eye, remove the cataracts. They're bandaged. You see them lying on beds in a hospital ward that no one in Australia would accept. And then the bandages are removed and they can see. It's a wonderful miracle. But I said to these girls, as I described this this morning, a remarkable positive indicator follows the work by these hospital teams, village by village. Within days of the cataracts being removed, the number of girls going to the schools in that village shoots up. It's just a happy indicator that follows automatically. And I asked my audience today if they knew why. And one young woman put her hand up and she said, it's because it's the girls who are chosen, the girls who have to care for the grandmother or grandfather when they can't see. They have to guide them around. And as soon as those operations take place and the grandmother or grandfather can get to the markets, can do the housework unassisted, the girls are liberated to go to school. One of the lessons out of this story is that the position of women and girls is a very useful indicator of a country's development. As a rough guide to how a country is faring, you can ask, what is the position of women and girls? And the other lesson is, if you give them rights and give them status, if you respect them, the whole society moves forward. It's powered forward. The girls go to school, and with their qualifications, they increase, to put it bluntly, they increase gross national product. They're out there properly engaged, not confined to the home, helping a disabled relative. So it's a rough guide of where a country stands, and it is the key to freeing up restraints on development. And that'll emerge from a number of examples I want to share with you today. Of the 1.3 billion poorest people in the world, 70% are women. Poverty is shouldered disproportionately by women. And when it comes to disadvantages in the workforce, such as illiteracy, again disproportionately shouldered by women. If you take the illiterate adults in the world today, estimated to be 770 million, 2/3 of them are women. That is 500 million women struggling to get by in a life without basic literacy skills. But we do know if literacy is conferred, then those women liberated from that restraint, help drive an economy and a society forward. All those nations in Southeast Asia that have transformed their economies are also nations that have enlisted the talents of girls and women and who can now boast, for example, that the percentage of women completing school is the same as it is for males. The percentage of women attending university in some of these Southeast Asian countries is now higher than it is for males. It's a measure of the economic transformation of the countries, but it's also a precondition of the economic transformation of these countries. There are some countries where the going is very tough. We know that in Melanesian cultures, we know that in the Pacific, there is an inbuilt societal bias against women and their proper participation in society. In Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Fiji, Vanuatu, women subsist in a warrior culture and they face a real challenge with the existence of domestic violence. I was in Vanuatu a few weeks ago and went to a centre that Australia set up with a remarkably strong woman leader. And she has insisted on proper legal assessment and treatment of domestic violence. And because we've given her a decent house for a centre, women who go there with problems of violence at home are able to talk to a legally qualified worker in a private room, not sharing a common room as had been the case before. In these small steps you make progress in societies where the inbuilt bias is very real. I just on some of these figures out of the Pacific are very sobering indeed. The fact that the rate of violence against women in the Pacific is double what the global average is. Two-thirds of women are said to be affected by violence in some of these societies. One of the reasons Hillary Clinton, whose work on this front has been heroic, insisted on going to the last meeting of the Pacific Islands Forum, was that she wanted to elevate the issue of the treatment of girls and women. And Julia Gillard moved in as well, announcing a $300 million Pacific Island package to protect women, to elevate their rights. Lisa is very proud of that. She knows how it's being implemented. It's going to result in measurable progress. Probably the hardest country we face is Afghanistan. I met a member of Parliament from Afghanistan yesterday as a representative of the Hazara community, which comprises about 19%, I'm told, of the Afghan population. And he provided a very sobering assessment of the level of human rights there. I learnt, speaking to Amnesty International yesterday as well, that 70 women leaders in Afghanistan had been murdered in the last year. So I said to my audiences today, they're women, perhaps a little older than the audiences I've been speaking to, who are heading a civil society organisation, a non-government organisation, and they're being, it seems, systematically murdered. And one of the young women I spoke to today at a meeting Lisa organised with non-government organisations said, well, she's from Amnesty International herself, she said, what guarantees, what help can there be post-2014 when the coalition forces are withdrawn, and without those armies from Europe and Asia, North America and elsewhere, women would seem to be exposed. We've made a lot of progress with women in Afghanistan. Before the Taliban was overthrown, you could count the women going to school, the girls going to school in Afghanistan in the tens of thousands. Today it's 3 million. Australia's played a terrific role in training women teachers for those schools that we've funded, that we've set up in Afghanistan. And we've done that with Indonesia because we thought it would be a good thing if another developing country, as it happens an Islamic country, could work side by side with us in training women to teach girls in newly built schools for girls in Afghanistan. But I'm filled with trepidation about their vulnerability when the armies have gone, and we're relying on President Karzai's government to see that the constitution of Afghanistan is honoured, a constitution that says there shall be equal rights for women and girls have a right to an education. Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world, culturally there's a bias against recognition of the rights of women and girls. It is very hard going. The progress there has been real. Those girls going to school, 3 million girls going to school who wouldn't be going to school if Taliban rule had continued. But there's going to be a new ethnic and regional balance, sustaining, we hope, a national government in Afghanistan. There might be elements of the insurgency admitted to government, to share in government, to be part of a coalition. Some people say that's the ultimate answer to bringing peace to the country. But we've got to press to see that those elements of the insurgency, former Taliban elements, recognise the Constitution and recognise the rights of women and girls. Afghanistan says a lot about dramatises these appalling statistics that demonstrate how women are still disadvantaged in the world. A lot of that disadvantage is concentrated in countries like Afghanistan. Elevating women's role in politics is important today. I said to those schoolgirls, I said, put up your hand if you want to go into public life, if you want to become a mayor or get elected to Parliament, state or federal, if you want to be a Prime Minister of Australia. And I guess 20 of them put their hands in the air, and I said, well, that's to be encouraged, because the number of women in Australian parliaments has gone from around 2 or 3% in the early 70s. I remember the women's electoral lobby getting organised at that time to make its case, to press its point. Eva Cox, who I was with on Q&A last week, was one of the pioneers of the women's electoral lobby, pressing to get more consideration for their agenda, but dealing with a parliaments that were overwhelmingly male. Today, Lisa reminds me that 30% of the federal parliament is female. And I just said on ABC radio, there's a difference in the tone of debate in a parliament, especially in party meetings, where women are occupying 30% of the seats. The boys' club atmosphere of the parliament is diminished. You've got a parliament more representative of the currents of opinion running through Australian society. But think of Papua New Guinea. It's got 3 women in the current parliament, a parliament of 111. In the previous term, it only had 1. I'm struck by something we Australians have devised to help overcome this, to edge Papua New Guinea forward. Melanesian culture, a warrior culture, a prejudice against women that you'd find in the Highlands, for example. How do you move a society like that? Well, the thing we've settled on is this. Village magistrates are very important in PNG. They settle disputes, they mediate in disputes over property or over domestic violence. In 2004, there were only 10 of them who were women across the whole country. We introduced a special training program for women to get them qualified to do the work of village magistrates. And today there are 700. In the villages of Papua New Guinea, you've got 700 women village magistrates. So the villagers are getting used to seeing women mediate these disputes and make these decisions. And we think that's a way of shifting their culture to a proper respect for the role of women and protection for women and girls. From only 7 village magistrates in 2004, only 10 in 2004, to 700 today. That's an investment in the future. And remember what I said earlier, the Melanesian world, the world of the Pacific presents real problems when it comes to the rights of women and girls. But again, let me underline the theme. It is necessary for proper economic development for countries to beat poverty, to liberate the talents of their women. It's estimated that if women had equal access to agricultural resources, there'd be up to 150 million fewer people living in hunger. That comes from the Food and Agriculture Organisation in research about the position of women, family farms, village communities, especially in Africa. Women haven't got equal access to agricultural resources. If they had the same rights in farm economies as men, there'd be 150 million people liberated from poverty. So if you're talking about tackling world poverty, beating extreme poverty, you have to elevate the agenda of empowering women and girls. One of the impediments, of course, to doing that is the reality of violence against women. All the improvements in education, health and participation are compromised if we can't say to women, your human right to live free from violence is respected. This International Women's Day, we're focusing on that, on stopping violence against women, perhaps the largest impediment to women achieving equality and fulfilling their potential. It's a problem in every country of the world. It affects a third of women globally. You could calculate that a billion people on the planet, all women, live under the threat of violence. The rate of violence against women is double in some Pacific countries, as I said earlier, with 2/3 of women affected by violence. A World Bank study of attitudes in a number of countries found that on average 29% of women agreed that wife-beating was justified for arguing with the husband. So there's a long way to go to shifting attitudes. 29% of women agreed that wife-beating was justified for arguing with the husband. 25% thought it was justified for refusing to have sex. Many countries still don't have laws against domestic violence. Even where those laws do exist, women struggle to get help from police and courts. So the revolution we saw in law enforcement in Australia in the 70s and 80s to render police sensitive to domestic violence is yet to come in these countries. There's one figure that says that as many as 80% of women in Afghanistan and Pakistan are affected by violence, and in these countries women active in public life face particular risks. It's been estimated that up to 90% of the casualties in contemporary conflicts are civilians, and most are women and children. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. We know that from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, from decades of civil war there, that rape has been used as a weapon of war, as a weapon of violence, as a weapon of control. Nearly 80% of the 800,000 refugees who fled Syria are women and children. I was in a refugee camp in Jordan, Zatari refugee camp, and I was horrified to hear that unaccompanied children had been among the refugees out of Syria, across the border at night into Jordan. And among the things we're doing for these wretched people who don't know whether their homes still stand or whether they'll ever be able to return or whether they might become another permanent refugee population in the Middle East, are kids. And we've provided these camps with child protection workers to see that they're safeguarded without parents, living in these camps without parents. We're the fourth biggest donor, the fourth biggest national donor to looking after Syrian refugees, but part of our focus has been on protecting the unaccompanied children who've ended up in refugee camps in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan. We're on the Security Council, and there's going to be a serious discussion of peacekeeping in the next few months on the UN, and we're going to highlight the role of women in periods of peace building. Out of our experience in the Solomon Islands, out of our experience in Timor-Leste, we think we can package lessons for the world community. In Liberia, for example, based on what we've learned in those Pacific and Asian jurisdictions, We've built 22 peace huts in partnership with UN Women. The huts provide a place for women leaders to meet and to help survivors of violence to get access to services. In our region, we've worked with Pacific Police Services and justice systems to increase awareness of the issues facing women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations. In Bougainville, for example, we recognised that women had to be a central part of the peace process. And in the Solomon Islands, through Ramsey, the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, we helped the government work towards a greater gender equality in its laws and policies. In a crucial development last year, the Solomon Islands High Court ruled that marital rape was no longer acceptable. Now, that's a milestone. I remember legislation to that effect being introduced in the New South Wales Parliament in the mid-80s, but now it's emerged in judge-made law in the Solomon Islands. Rape within marriage is illegal. Australian support to the Solomon Islands Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions directly contributed to this landmark decision. And that represents a real shift in thinking, in values, in one of those warrior cultures of the Melanesian world. Elsewhere, we're ramping up our efforts through Australia's aid program to tackle violence. We're investing $320 million over the next 10 years in the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Initiative. That's going to support more than 150,000 services, counselling, medical assistance and safe shelter to help women who experience violence. And Australian funding will also support prevention activities through women's groups. It'll also support male advocates and Pacific leadership networks to assist men to be drivers of social change. We'll also be making marketplaces safer for women in Papua New Guinea to help women earn an income through selling their produce without the risk of violence. If they can sell the produce from farms, especially those women who, in the highlands, have been deserted by their husbands, left behind by their husbands, then that will be the most practical assistance one could imagine. Consistent with all of these initiatives, I'm pleased to announce today that the Australian Government will provide a further $24 million over 5 years to help end violence against women in Cambodia. Our funding will deliver emergency medical treatment, counselling and legal services and provide safe places for women and their children to stay. In the relatively short period I've been Minister for Foreign Affairs, I've had the privilege to talk with many extraordinary women and girls around the world, midwives in the Western Highlands of Papua New Guinea, women police officers in Honiara, female students in Sri Lanka, women politicians in Myanmar, nuns who've pioneered women's education in Sri Lanka and the Highlands of New Guinea. Women doing quite extraordinary things in difficult environments and complex circumstances. They've all told me the same thing. They don't want to be seen as victims and they don't want charity. They want opportunity, they want dignity, they want their fundamental freedoms protected, access to education, employment, finance and health services. And I take great pride in the fact that Australia, through our aid program, is participating in this quiet revolution to elevate the rights of women and girls in developing countries. Let me conclude with two stories that have dramatised it. In this school, I visited a girls' school, a Catholic girls' school in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, just outside Mount Hagen. I met a feisty nun who'd been there for 50 years. She went from Ohio to Mount Hagen. It's a very big transition. And her goal was to set up a women's school. She told me this story, and it shows how compelling this case is. She said there's a practice in the Highlands culture of men, when they've got one family, leaving that family and moving off and starting another. They'll leave behind their first wife and the girls. They'll take the boys with them. So the woman and the girls are left in poverty. The husband moves on and might do it a second time. So the nun told me this story about this practice in the Highlands. She said some of the girls at this school have been placed here at great financial cost by mothers who've been deserted by their husbands in those circumstances, and their mothers are determined that their girls will receive an education so this never happens to them. And there's the yearning of a mother down through the ages to see that her daughter does not have her rights denied as they had been for her. These lovely, gentle Highland girls welcomed me with a sing-sing to this very sweet school. It was beautiful, but I thought the welcome was all the more beautiful when I heard that story about the social distress and the aspirations of women that lies behind it. Let me give my daughter a stronger place in this society than I had. The other story is this: in Phnom Penh, I went to a great training college where hundreds of young women were being trained as midwives. When I told this story to the girls at school this morning, I said these girls were your age, maybe a little older, and they're being trained as midwives by Australian Aid. We're pumping the money in to see that they're trained to be there when there's a birth being delivered, to help deliver the birth. The figures are terrible. The figures are that in childbirth, 500 mothers will die for every 100,000 births in a poor developing country like Cambodia. That is a terrible death toll. 500 deaths for every 100,000 births, 500 mothers dying. And largely because they're there without any assistance. These midwives were young girls from very poor backgrounds from the country. Cambodia is a very poor country. Its villages have been exploited by kings and dictators over the centuries. There's no wealth left in those villages, and the peasants are exploited. So without anything, they've been recruited for training. They're becoming midwives. I've never seen anyone wear a uniform with more pride than these girls, and big smiling faces to welcome the Australian delegation and their own health minister. They had mannequins on the bed that they would use as they learnt how to assist in a birth. As a result of more of them being recruited and sent out to the villages, the number of deaths per 100,000 births has fallen from around over 500 to about 220. As they penetrate the country, it will come down to where it is in Australia, around about eight maternal deaths per 100,000 births. And that's all with Australian aid money. And it's making a difference, a real difference. But the story begins and it ends with respect for the rights and responsibilities of girls and women. That's the way you measure how backward a country it is. And that's the tool you use, the elevation of women and girls. That's the tool you use to drive the country forward. On this International Women's Day, I say Australia's voice must continue to be loud and clear in demanding equality and justice for women and girls around the world. And that program, that commitment, will continue to figure big in all that Australia does as a good global citizen. Thank you.
Senator Carr has said that he's more than happy to have some questions, and I believe we've got a roving mic, so if you put your hand up high, and we'll get a mic to you. So we'll start down here. And finally, I'd like to invite Pat McConville up from the United Nations Association of Australia Tasmania Division to give the vote of thanks. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks very much, Sue, and to the University of Tasmania and the events team here for helping to organise this event, which is obviously co-hosted. Thanks to Senator Lisa Singh for appealing to Minister Carr to come down and to speak with interested Hobartians and Tasmanians about aid and foreign affairs. As Sue said, my name is Pat McConville. I'm the President of the United Nations Association Tasmanian Division. We are a national organisation, though, and we're very pleased to be part of this International Women's Day event and to raise the profile, hopefully, of this day and of the Australian Aid Program and what it's doing for women and girls around the world. International Women's Day is really important for all the reasons that Senator Carr outlined so eloquently. The gaps in equality around the world between men and women, boys and girls, are shocking in terms of education, of poverty, opportunities to work and advance oneself and one's family economically, and in terms of civic participation. And it's really important that we don't forget what a task there is ahead to try and close the gap between the genders across the world. Of course, I'm always conscious that, you know, I call myself a feminist and identify as a feminist, but as a man talking about women's issues, I'm always conscious that there is something of a discrepancy there. Indeed, I believe that it is vital for women to be able to be empowered to tell their own stories, of course, but it also, as Senator Carr outlined, is in the interests of all people in the community for women and all people in the community to participate fully in that community. It's also important to remember that a lot of the time it's actually men erecting those barriers to progress and participation, inadvertently, sometimes intentionally, but perhaps most horrifying of all, tacitly. So it really is incumbent upon all members of our community, men and women, to be aware of those barriers to participation that do exist. Of course, the most compelling reason for a man to speak out on these sort of issues is because there is an important element of empathy that needs to occur in our community. The United Nations is a structure, an international organisation that is built on empathy. Out of the ashes of World War II, we realised that there was a universal human dignity that was affronted by that war and some of the tragic things that happened throughout the course of those events. And it's on that common human dignity that was realised at the end of that conflict that the United Nations rests. The fraternity of men and the sorority of women all around the world as part of a human family. The United Nations is not, our organisation believes, and hopefully you do too, just an abstract international system, just a large machine that works independent of people. In the United Nations Charter, it expresses the idea that the United Nations is built on we the peoples, and that's a very important thing to remember. The United Nations Association of Australia is the people's voice for the UN. We support Australian participation in the United Nations, and Australia was one of the founding members of the United Nations. We support initiatives that get Australia involved in multilateral action, and we supported very strongly the Security Council bid that Australia put forth and was eventually successful in. We lobbied the government on issues, as we did last year with the government's commitment to implement fully the Convention Against Torture and other issues, many of which have come up tonight in this forum. And we educate people in the community about the UN through events like this, but also in conjunction with our partners like UN Youth Australia, who has a presence here on campus. And if you want to join UNAA, or if you want to join UN Youth Australia, please feel free to come and visit me out the front, or grab one of the information forms that we have out on the tables out there. Indeed, if you do join us, it allows our voice to become clearer and stronger to advocate on behalf of people around the world and for Australia's participation in international aid and in multilateral organisations. I think the turnout tonight is a real signal to Minister Carr that Tasmanians, Australians, taxpayers, interested citizens are really concerned with foreign affairs and really especially concerned with foreign aid and what we're doing to help people around the world. And I'm sure that, as he's mentioned on a number of issues, he'll take the concerns that you've raised in terms of the Australian aid program and some of the other foreign policy issues back to the policy drawing board. I want to thank Minister Carr for coming down and speaking with us and importantly listening to people who are interested and engaged in the foreign policy space. And before we close, I would invite you all to show your appreciation to Minister Carr in the usual way.